I've worked in HVAC for almost 20 years now, and throughout that time I've seen almost every different residential and commercial property. I've also encountered my fair share of unreasonable clients and a handful of other really tough situations. However, I've only had one truly frightening and bizarre experience so far, though it was enough to make me question my own sanity. This happened several years ago when a few other technicians and I went out to this older commercial building a few towns over. The building itself was a 5-story office complex constructed back in the 70s with a massive HVAC system that included extensive ductwork snaking through every floor. Our company had been called in to perform routine maintenance and troubleshoot some odd complaints, uneven temperatures across the building, a persistent rattling noise from the vents, and an occasional foul odor that no one could pinpoint. The system itself was a beast, an older commercial setup with dual air handlers, a chiller unit, and a sprawling network of galvanized steel ducts that hadn't been updated in decades. I showed up with 2 other techs, Mike, a younger guy still green around the edges but sharp, and Dave, a grizzled veteran who'd scoff at anything he couldn't fix with a wrench and some logic. The building manager, Mr. Thompson, met us out front. He was a jittery guy, mid-40s with bags under his eyes and a habit of glancing around like he was waiting for bad news. He told us the HVAC issues had been plaguing the tenants for weeks, and some had even reported feeling uneasy, like they were being watched through the vents. He practically begged us to wrap it up fast. Anyway, we started working in the basement where the main HVAC unit hummed away. It was a hulking system, with a pair of compressors and a condenser coil that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Carter administration. We ran our standard checks, tested the airflow, inspected the evaporator coils, and calibrated the pressure sensors. Everything seemed fine until we heard it. A faint scritch, scritch, scritch echoing from one of the main supply ducts. At first Dave waved it off, just thermal expansion, he said, tapping the duct with his knuckles. Older buildings like this groan all the time. Mike wasn't so sure though. He kept staring at the duct opening, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Personally, I wasn't convinced either. In 20 years, I'd heard plenty of HVAC noises, rattling dampers, loose fan belts, even the odd bird trapped in a vent, but this sounded different. It sounded deliberate. I grabbed our duct camera, a little snake-like device with a high-res lens, and fed it into the main trunk line. The monitor flickered to life, showing the dusty interior of the duct. Cobwebs, a few dead bugs, but nothing unusual. Then, about 25 feet in, the camera panned across something that made my stomach drop. It was a figure, human-shaped, crouched low, crawling through the duct. The grainy footage caught tattered fabric hanging off its frame and a flash of pale skin before it jerked out of sight. Mike let out a shaky breath, and even Dave, Mr. Skeptic himself, leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tight. "Probably a rat," he muttered, but his voice wavered. "A big one." I rewound the clip. No way that was a rat. The size, the movement, it was a person to be sure, but who'd be insane enough to crawl through an active HVAC system? We decided we had to escalate this to Mr. Thompson, but our phones had no signal down in the basement and the landline was dead, a buzzing static that cut off when I picked it up. Unease began to prickle up my spine, but we pressed on, moving to the air handlers on the 3rd floor. That's when we found the first real clue, a vent cover in the ceiling, unscrewed from the inside, its screws scattered on the carpet below. Mike's voice cracked. "Someone's been in there. We need to call the cops." Dave snorted. "What, over a loose vent? Probably a janitor messing around." But even so, I could see doubt beginning to creep into his eyes. As the day dragged on and the sun dipped below the horizon, the building emptied out. The usual hum of office life faded, leaving us in a silence that felt heavy and oppressive. We were troubleshooting a pressure imbalance. Airflow readings were all over the place, like something was blocking the ducts, when we heard footsteps thudding across the 4th floor above us. We froze, assuming it was just one of the employees, until a sharp tap 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 came through the vent right overhead. I aimed my flashlight into the grill, but saw nothing but shadows. The tapping stopped, but then Mike swore he saw something. A face, he said, peering back at him before it vanished. By now, we were done. Whatever this was, it wasn't worth sticking around for. We packed our tools and headed for the stairwell, only to find the door locked from the outside. I rattled the handle, pounded on the steel, but nothing. It wasn't stuck, but rather someone had sealed us in. Mike started hyperventilating, banging on the door and yelling for help. Dave tried to pry it open with a crowbar, but the lock held firm. "Calm down," he snapped at Mike. "We'll figure this out," but his hands were shaking too. With no cell service and no way out, we made a call. We'd use the ducts. The main return air duct ran vertically through the building, wide enough to crawl through, and it'd take us back to the basement where we could exit through the loading dock. I went first, squeezing into the cramped, dusty tunnel with my flashlight clenched in my teeth. The air was thick with mildew, and every creak of the metal amplified my heartbeat. I crawled maybe 30 feet, navigating a junction where the ducts split, when I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, bouncing off the walls. Get out. I stopped cold, sweat beading on my forehead. Dave? Mike? I called back to them, but they hadn't heard it, just me. I pushed on, the duct narrowing until my shoulders scraped the sides. Ahead, I spotted a faint glow, a vent opening into an office. I shoved the grill loose and spilled out onto the floor of a dusty, abandoned room on the second floor. Old desks and chairs loomed in the dark, but the door was unlocked. Dave and Mike tumbled out behind me, and we bolted for the hallway. The power was out, plunging the floor into blackness. Our flashlights cut through the gloom as we raced for the stairwell, but then we heard footsteps pounding behind us, too close and too fast. We hit the basement, and there, by the HVAC unit, we saw him. A man stood hunched over the control panel, fiddling with the wiring. He was thin as a rail, draped in ragged clothes, his face hollow and smeared with grime. When Dave shouted, he spun around, wild-eyed, clutching a rusty wrench. He charged, swinging, and I ducked as the tool whizzed past my head. Dave managed to tackle him, pinning him to the concrete. "Who are you?" Dave roared. "What the hell are you doing?" The man thrashed, muttering, "They watch, through the vents, always watching." His voice was unhinged, and his gaze darted to the ducts above. The three of us managed to hold him down until the cops arrived. It turned out he was a former maintenance worker, fired years back after a mental breakdown. He'd apparently been squatting in the building ever since, using the HVAC system to move undetected. He would just tamper with the dampers, rerouting airflow, and live in the shadows. The police hauled him off, but not before he fixed us with a stare and hissed, "You think I'm alone? There are others in the dark." By all accounts, that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next day, we went back to finish the job. New filters, a recalibrated thermostat, the works. I was clearing debris from a duct when I found it, a hidden panel pried open, revealing a stash of old Polaroids. Each one showed a different person, employees I guessed, their eyes scratched out with something sharp. Tucked beneath was a note in scrawled handwriting, "They see everything." I showed it to Mr. Thompson, and his face drained of color. He admitted there had been rumors, disappearances, and weird noises tied to the building for years. He had always ignored them, chalking it up to urban legends. We turned the photos over to the cops and got out of there as fast as we could. Since then, I've worked plenty of jobs, but that one still sticks with me. Now every time I hear an odd hum from a condenser or a rattle in a vent, I'm back in that basement, staring at those wild eyes. Was it just a crazy guy living in the ducts, messing with the system? Or was there something else, something tied to the whispers, the tapping, and the feeling of eyes on me? I know I'll never know for sure, but I've got a thermal imager now, and I double-check every duct I service. Because deep down, I can't shake the thought that he wasn't lying, about the others, the things that live in the dark, watching through the vents. This happened back when I was new to HVAC. I think it was either my third or fourth job ever. The company I worked for paired me up with another technician named Scott, and he was a weird dude, to say the least. Scott had this gaunt look about him, like he hadn't slept in days, and his hands trembled slightly when he wasn't holding tools. He'd been with the company for years, but he barely spoke, just grunts or one-word answers. I figured he was just burned out, but there was something about his stare that made my skin crawl. We were sent to troubleshoot an air conditioning unit at an old strip mall on the edge of town. The call came from a small thrift store owner who said the AC had been cutting out randomly, leaving the place sweltering. It was late summer and the heat was brutal, so I was glad to get out of the sun and into the job. The store itself was cluttered with dusty clothes and chipped furniture, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't circulated in years. Scott led the way to the back where the rooftop access was. We climbed a rickety metal ladder and stepped onto the gravel-covered roof. The AC unit was a battered old package system, probably a 10-ton unit judging by the size. It was humming faintly, but I could tell something was off. Scott dropped his tool bag and started pulling out his manifold gauges to check the refrigerant pressures, muttering something under his breath I couldn't quite catch. I grabbed my multimeter and began testing the condenser fan motor while Scott hooked up the gauges to the service ports. The low side pressure was way too high, and the high side was dropping, classic signs of a clogged filter dryer or maybe a failing compressor. I was about to say something when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from inside the unit. I froze. "You hear that?" I asked, looking at Scott. Scott didn't even glance up. "Vibration," he grunted, tightening the hose on the Schrader valve. But it didn't sound like vibration to me. Instead, it was too alive. I leaned closer to the unit, and the growl came again, louder this time, followed by a sharp thump. It was almost like something heavy was shifting inside the casing. My heart skipped a beat. These units weren't hollow enough for anything big to be inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone up there. "Scott, I think we should shut it down and open it up," I said, trying to sound calm. He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Finish the pressures first." Reluctantly, I kept working, but the noises didn't stop. The thumping grew rhythmic, almost deliberate, and then the unit started vibrating, not the usual hum of running system, but a violent shudder that rattled the rooftop gravel. I checked the gauges again. The pressures were spiking, way beyond normal operating range. If we didn't kill the power soon, the compressor could seize, or worse, the lines could burst. "Scott, we need to," I started, but he cut me off by slamming his hand on the disconnect switch, killing the unit. The silence that followed was deafening, but it only lasted a second before a piercing screech erupted from inside the AC. I jumped back, dropping my multimeter. Scott didn't flinch. Instead, he grabbed a pry bar from his bag and started wrenching open the access panel. "What are you doing?" I shouted, but he ignored me. The panel popped off with a groan of rusted metal, and I swear I saw something move inside, a flash of slick, dark skin and a glint of sharp edges. But before I could even process it, Scott reached in with his bare hand. There was a wet, tearing sound, and he yanked out something. It was dripping and mangled, like a shredded mass of feathers and flesh, but it was too dark to make out details. He tossed it onto the roof, and it landed with a sickening splat. The smell hit me next, rotten and metallic, like blood mixed with Freon. "Critter got stuck," he said, wiping his hand on his pants. "Happens sometimes." I stared at the mess, my stomach churning. That didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. Not a bird, not a squirrel, nothing that belonged in an AC unit. But Scott was already closing the panel, acting like nothing happened. We finished the job in silence, replaced the filter dryer, recharged the refrigerant with R410A, and got the system running again. The pressure stabilized, and the unit purred like it was brand new. Back at the shop, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked one of the older techs about Scott. He hesitated, then said, "Scott's seen some weird stuff on jobs, doesn't talk about it, probably why he's so quiet." A few days later, I heard the thrift store had closed down overnight. No explanation, just a "for lease" sign slapped on the door. I drove by the strip mall out of curiosity, and when I climbed up to check the AC unit again, the access panel was ajar. Inside, I found claw marks gouged into the metal, deep, jagged lines that no tool could have made. I stayed at that company for a while after that, but Scott moved on, taking solo jobs. Sometimes I wonder what else he's pulled out of those systems, and what he's left behind. Now, whenever I hear an AC kick on, I listen for that growl, praying it's just my imagination. Whenever people hear the term HVAC, if they even know what it means, they might imagine a bunch of ducts and fans. While that's certainly part of it, there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes, and some projects are significantly more challenging than others. 8 years ago, my company got this contract for renovating and maintaining this building that would be used as some kind of high-tech lab with wind tunnels, among other things. I didn't know a whole lot going into it, and I don't think any of us technicians did. The building itself was a hulking gray monstrosity on the edge of the city, an old factory converted into a state-of-the-art research facility. The most striking feature was definitely the wind tunnels. They were enormous steel tubes designed to test aerospace components under extreme conditions. The place had an industrial chill to it, with exposed pipes and concrete walls that seemed to swallow sound. My task was to revamp the HVAC system, which was essential for keeping the labs at precise temperatures and preventing contaminants from fouling the experiments. The system was a relic: rusted ductwork, wheezing air handlers, and a patchwork of outdated controls that barely functioned. On my first day, I met the owner, Sophia Langston. She was breathtaking, long dark hair, high cheekbones, and hazel eyes that could have stopped traffic. But her beauty was overshadowed by her attitude. When I introduced myself, she barely looked up from her tablet. "Fix it fast," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "I don't have time for screw-ups." She turned away before I could respond, leaving me standing there, toolbox in hand, feeling like I'd just been dismissed by royalty. I tried my best to brush it off and get to work, starting with a survey of the system. The ductwork was a nightmare, miles of galvanized steel twisting through the building, some sections so narrow I had to shimmy through on my stomach. The air smelled metallic and damp, and every clink of my tools echoed like a gunshot. As I worked, I noticed odd pressure drops in the supply lines. The gauges showed fluctuations that shouldn't have been there, even with the wind tunnels running. I figured it was a balancing issue with the dampers, but it nagged at me. Things got weird a few nights later. I was alone in the mechanical room, troubleshooting a bulky compressor, when I heard a low hum. Not the usual drone of the equipment, but something deeper, almost vocal. I shut off the unit to listen. The sound stopped, but then came a sharp tap 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 from inside the return duct overhead. I grabbed a ladder and peered through the grill, shining my flashlight inside. Nothing but dust and shadows. Probably just thermal expansion, I told myself, but my pulse was still racing. The next day, I found a puddle of condensation near the chiller that hadn't been there before. The pipes were sweating more than they should have, even accounting for humidity. I checked the insulation, intact, and the refrigerant levels, normal. Then, as I adjusted the expansion valve, I felt a cold gust hit my neck, like someone had opened a freezer door behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. The hair on my arm stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Sophia herself did nothing to help. Every time I tried to update her on the progress, she'd snap at me, "Why isn't it done yet?" or "Can't you work faster?" Her hostility grated on me, but I figured the best thing to do was to keep my head down. Still, there were moments when I'd catch her watching me from across the lab, her expression unreadable, before she'd look away. The real trouble started when I traced a persistent airflow issue to the basement. The building's lower level housed the main air handler and a tangle of feeder ducts that tied into the wind tunnels. It was a dim, cavernous space, lit by flickering fluorescents that buzzed like angry wasps. As I inspected the unit, I found a sealed access panel behind it, caked with grime. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open with a screwdriver. Beyond it was a tight crawl space, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The air inside was frigid and carried a faint, sour odor. I squeezed through, dragging my tools, and emerged into a hidden chamber. The walls were lined with old control boxes, their wires dangling like dead vines. In the corner sat a stack of moldy logbooks. I flipped through one, then froze. It documented HVAC tests from the 1970s, when the building was a military research site. Entries described anomalous readings and personnel complaints of auditory disturbances. One page mentioned a worker who'd gone missing after reporting something moving in the ducts. The last entry was dated the day the project shut down. I sat there, flashlight trembling, as the pieces started to fall into place. The pressure drops, the noises, the cold spots. Could this place be haunted by its past? Before I could process it, though, a loud bang echoed from the crawl space. I scrambled back, heart pounding, and saw the access panel had slammed shut on its own. I forced it open and climbed out, vowing to tell Sophia everything. I found her in her office, poring over schematics. "We need to talk," I said, dropping the logbook on her desk. She glared at me, but as I explained what I'd found, the chamber, the history, and the missing worker, her face softened. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes. "I knew about the rumors," she admitted, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "People say this place is cursed. I didn't want to believe it. I can't afford to. This lab is my dream." "Then why push me away?" I asked. She hesitated, then met my gaze. "I wasn't pushing you away. I just didn't know how to act around you. You're good at this, better than I expected, and I guess I got flustered. I've been rude because I didn't want you to see I liked you." I blinked, caught completely off guard. "You like me?" She gave a small, embarrassed nod, and suddenly her hostility made sense. Not anger, but a mask for something else. Together, we tackled the building's secrets. We traced the pressure issues to a cracked plenum in the wind tunnel exhaust, which was pulling air unpredictably through the system. The noises were vibrations from loose duct fittings, amplified by the tunnel's acoustics. The cold spots? A miscalibrated economizer cycling outside air at the wrong times. The haunting was just a poorly maintained HVAC setup, worsened by the building's eerie vibe and its grim history. As we worked, Sophia also opened up. She'd inherited the lab from her father, a scientist who died before seeing it finished. The pressure to succeed had made her guarded, but with me, she started to let her walls down. We'd laugh over coffee breaks, debate airflow calculations, and steal glances that lingered longer each time. One night, after sealing the last duct leak, she grabbed my hand. "You didn't just fix this place," she said. "You fixed me too." I pulled her close, and we kissed under the hum of the air handler, a sound that no longer scared me. After that, the lab thrived, its HVAC system purring like a dream, variable frequency drives, tight seals, and perfect pressure balance. Sophia and I grew inseparable, our partnership turning into love. We married a year later in the lab's courtyard, the wind tunnels roaring in celebration. Today, we run the facility together, living happily ever after in a place once shadowed by fear, now bright with our shared future.